For hundreds of years, the image of a Viking has remained almost unchanged in our minds. We picture tall warriors with pale skin, long blonde hair, and bright blue eyes, sailing across dark seas in wooden ships, raiding villages, and shaping medieval Europe through force and fear. Movies, TV shows, books, and even school textbooks have repeated this image so often that it feels like an unquestionable truth. The Vikings become a symbol of a single people from Scandinavia, genetically pure, physically uniform, and culturally isolated until they suddenly burst onto the world stage. But what if this image is mostly wrong? What if the Vikings were never a single type of people at all? What if the legendary Viking identity had far more to do with lifestyle and culture than blood or appearance? These questions remain unanswered for generations because historians could only rely on written records, burial objects, and old stories. That all changed when modern science gained the ability to read ancient DNA. Recently, the largest Viking DNA study ever conducted examined the genetic material of 442 ancient individuals from more than 80 archaeological sites across Europe and beyond. What scientists discovered did not simply add new details to Viking history. It completely overturned it. The results show that many of the beliefs we have held about Vikings for centuries are either incomplete or entirely false. Vikings were not mostly blonde. They were not genetically uniform. They were not even always Scandinavian. Some people buried as Vikings had no Scandinavian ancestry at all, while others with Viking blood never lived as Vikings. Even more surprising, Vikings living just miles apart often had less genetic connection to each other than they did to people living thousands of miles away. This study revealed that the Viking world was a complex web of movement, mixing, and cultural exchange that involved people from all over Europe and parts of Asia. Instead of a closed society, Viking culture was open, flexible, and deeply connected to the wider world. The popular image of Vikings as a single race of northern warriors simply cannot survive when faced with genetic evidence. This groundbreaking research forces us to rethink not just who the Vikings were, but how identity itself worked in the medieval world. Viking history, it turns out, is not a story of purity and isolation. It is a story of diversity, adaptation, and constant change. The dramatic change in our understanding of Vikings became possible because of one powerful scientific tool: ancient DNA analysis. For most of history, scholars had no way to know what people from the Viking Age truly looked like, or where their ancestors came from. They depended on sagas written long after events happened, objects found in graves, and the opinions of earlier historians. While these sources were valuable, they often reflected cultural bias, myth-making, or incomplete information. DNA changed everything. In this massive study, scientists from the University of Copenhagen and many other international institutions worked together to sequence the complete genomes of 442 individuals who lived during the Viking Age. These remains came from over 80 archaeological sites spread across Scandinavia, the British Isles, the Baltic region, Greenland, and parts of Eastern Europe. Some skeletons were found in ship burials, others in battle graves, and some in quiet farming communities. Each set of bones carried a genetic record that had been preserved for more than 1,000 years. To access this information, researchers carefully extracted DNA from teeth and dense bones, which protect genetic material better than other parts of the skeleton. Every sample went through strict testing to prevent contamination from modern DNA. Once the genetic data was collected, scientists compared it with both ancient populations and modern people across Europe. This allowed them to track ancestry, movement, family relationships, and even physical traits like hair color, eye color, and immune system adaptations. The scale of the project was unlike anything attempted before in Viking studies. Previous research had looked at small groups or single burial sites. This time, scientists could see the Viking world as a whole. What they found surprised even the experts leading the project. One of the main researchers explained that people often think of Vikings as one united group, but genetically, this simply was not true. Instead of a single origin, Viking populations showed ancestry from many different regions. The DNA revealed connections to Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, the Arctic regions, and the British Isles. Even within Scandinavia, Viking communities were genetically different from one another. This meant that Viking identity was not based on shared blood alone. The study also allowed researchers to follow Viking movement across generations. They could see where people traveled, where they settled, and whether they returned home or stayed abroad. Genetic markers showed that Viking expansion was not random. Different groups followed specific routes again and again over many generations. This level of detail had never been possible before. DNA also helped answer questions that archaeology alone could not. For example, two people might be buried with similar weapons and grave goods, but DNA could reveal whether they were related by blood or came from entirely different backgrounds. In many cases, people buried with full Viking honors turned out to have no Scandinavian ancestry at all. This showed that Viking culture could be adopted by outsiders who fully embrace a lifestyle. At the same time, DNA revealed people with Scandinavian ancestry who lived completely non-Viking lives in other regions. This scientific approach transformed Vikings from a simple historical stereotype into a complex, living population shaped by travel, trade, war, and cultural exchange. By reading the genetic record written inside ancient bones, researchers uncovered a Viking world far more diverse and connected than anyone had imagined. One of the most surprising discoveries from the largest Viking DNA study directly challenges the most famous Viking stereotype of all, the idea that Vikings were tall, pale, blonde-haired, and blue-eyed. This image has been repeated for centuries and is deeply rooted in modern culture. Movies, television shows, comic books, and even school illustrations often show Vikings as the perfect example of a Nordic look. However, when scientists analyze the genetic markers responsible for hair color, eye color, and skin tone in Viking-age individuals, they found a very different reality. Most Vikings were not blonde at all. In fact, dark hair and darker eye colors were far more common among Viking populations than they are in modern Scandinavia today. This finding shocked many researchers because it showed that today's Scandinavian appearance does not accurately represent how people looked during the Viking Age. Genetic evidence revealed that the traits we now associate with Scandinavia, such as very light hair and eyes, became more common only after the Viking Age had already ended. This means that if modern Scandinavians were standing next to real Vikings from 1,000 years ago, the Vikings would likely appear noticeably darker. The DNA study showed that genes related to pigmentation changed over time due to natural selection, migration, and population mixing after the Viking period. These changes happened slowly over generations, shaping the modern population in ways that did not reflect the past. The idea of the blonde Viking, therefore, is more a product of later history and modern imagination than ancient reality. This discovery forces us to question why the blonde stereotype became so dominant. Part of the reason lies in 19th and 20th century nationalism, when European scholars and artists idealized Vikings as symbols of racial purity and strength. These ideas were later reinforced by popular media, creating an image that felt historical but was actually very recent. DNA evidence cuts through these myths and shows what Vikings really look like, not what later generations wanted them to represent. More importantly, this finding highlights a deeper truth about Viking identity. Physical appearance was not what made someone a Viking. The genetic diversity found in Viking populations suggests that people of many different looks could participate in Viking culture. Dark-haired warriors, light-haired farmers, and people with mixed ancestry all existed within the Viking world. The idea that Vikings shared a single appearance simply does not hold up under scientific examination. This discovery also helps explain how Viking culture spread so widely and successfully. A society that accepted people from different backgrounds was far more adaptable than one based on strict physical or genetic boundaries. By letting go of the blonde Viking myth, we begin to see Vikings not as a uniform group, but as a dynamic population shaped by movement, contact, and change. The DNA evidence replaces an outdated stereotype with a far richer and more realistic picture of who the Vikings truly were. AS scientists continued analyzing the Viking DNA. An even bigger surprise emerged. The Vikings were not just diverse in appearance. They were also genetically mixed in ways no one expected. Even Vikings who lived their entire lives in Scandinavia were not genetically pure or isolated. Instead, their DNA showed ancestry from many different parts of Europe and beyond. Genetic markers revealed links to Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, the British Isles, Arctic populations like the Sami, and even regions connected to Western Asia. This meant that long before the Viking Age officially began, people from distant lands had already moved into Scandinavia, settled there, and become part of the population. These migrations did not happen only after Viking raids began. They occurred gradually over centuries, creating a genetic foundation that was already mixed when the Viking Age started. This discovery completely changed the idea that Vikings suddenly appeared as a unified group of Scandinavian people who then expanded outward. Instead, the people who became Vikings were already a genetic mosaic formed by earlier waves of movement and contact. DNA evidence showed that gene flow into Scandinavia increased just before and during the Viking Age. People arrived from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, and areas farther east, bringing their genes, skills, and ambitions with them. Some of these newcomers likely became part of Viking society, contributing to the energy and expansion that defined the era. This challenges a traditional belief that Viking exploration and raiding were driven only by local Scandinavian population pressure or climate change. The genetic data suggests that outside influences played an important role in shaping Viking society itself. Even more surprising was how uneven this genetic mixing was. Coastal Viking communities were highly connected to the wider world, while some inland populations remained genetically isolated for thousands of years. This shows that Viking diversity was not evenly spread across the region. Instead, it followed patterns based on lifestyle, geography, and access to trade routes. People who lived along the coast had constant contact with travelers, traders, and settlers from faraway lands. Their genes reflected this movement. Meanwhile, farming communities living just a few miles inland often showed little genetic change, remaining similar to ancient European farmers from much earlier periods. This created a strange situation where two groups living close to each other could be genetically very different. DNA analysis revealed that Vikings often had more genetic similarity to people in distant regions than to their inland neighbors. This finding defies common sense, but makes perfect sense when lifestyle is considered. Viking society was built around the sea. Ships were their highways, and coastlines were their gateways to the world. Inland communities, focused on farming and local life, were far less connected. Over time, this created a sharp genetic divide within Scandinavia itself. The Viking world was not a single unified population, but a collection of interconnected coastal communities, surrounded by more isolated inland groups. This genetic patchwork explains why Viking culture was so adaptable and successful. It was shaped by many influences and constantly renewed by contact with the outside world. The DNA evidence reveals that Viking history is not just about raids and conquests, but about movement, mixing, and the blending of peoples across vast distances. One of the most puzzling discoveries in the Viking DNA study was the sharp genetic divide between coastal Viking communities and inland farming populations, especially in Sweden. Scientists expected to find some level of mixing between people who lived relatively close to each other. Instead, the genetic evidence revealed almost no reproductive contact between these two groups, even when they lived just a few miles apart. Coastal Vikings, who were deeply connected to sea travel and long-distance movement, showed genetic links to populations across Europe and parts of Asia. Inland farmers, on the other hand, appeared genetically frozen in time. Their DNA closely resembled that of ancient European farming communities from thousands of years earlier. This meant that major genetic movements that shaped much of Europe during the Bronze Age and Iron Age had largely bypassed these inland populations. The contrast was striking. Viking communities living along the coast were genetically diverse and outward-looking, while inland societies remained genetically conservative and inward-focused. Statistical analysis showed something almost unbelievable. Coastal Vikings had more genetic connections to people living thousands of miles away than to their inland neighbors. This discovery raised important questions about how people lived and interacted during the Viking Age. The answer seems to lie in lifestyle rather than geography. Vikings were seafarers. Their world revolved around ships, ports, and trade routes. The sea connected them to distant lands, while forests, mountains, and limited infrastructure separated inland communities. Inland farmers focused on agriculture, seasonal cycles, and local survival. Their way of life did not encourage long-distance travel or frequent contact with outsiders. As a result, their gene pools remained relatively closed. Over centuries, these differences created two genetically distinct populations living side by side in the same region. DNA evidence suggests that Viking culture itself acted as a barrier. Becoming a Viking was not just about where you lived, but how you lived. Coastal communities built their identity around sailing, raiding, trading, and exploration. Inland populations followed traditions centered on land and farming. These cultural differences limited intermarriage and social integration. This finding challenges the idea that Viking society was dominant across all of Scandinavia. In reality, Viking culture was strongest along the coasts, while large parts of inland Scandinavia followed very different social and genetic paths. The inland populations were not conquered or absorbed in a way one might expect. Instead, they remained separate, preserving older genetic patterns long after the Viking Age began. This separation also helps explain why Viking influence spread more strongly overseas than inland. Vikings were not focused on expanding territory within Scandinavia itself. Their attention was directed outward, toward the sea and new opportunities beyond their homeland. The DNA evidence shows that this outward focus shaped not only Viking history, but also the genetic landscape of the region. It created a society where global connections were stronger than local ones. The inland mystery reminds us that history is rarely uniform. Even during famous periods like the Viking Age, different communities experience the same era in very different ways. Genetics allows us to see these hidden divisions, revealing a Viking world far more complex than legends ever suggested. The Viking Age is often imagined as a time of chaos, with warriors randomly attacking distant lands wherever opportunity appeared. However, the DNA evidence tells a very different story. The largest Viking DNA study revealed that Viking movement across Europe followed clear, organized, and repeated patterns. These were not spontaneous journeys made without planning. Instead, different Viking groups from Scandinavia followed specific routes generation after generation. Genetic markers allowed scientists to trace where Vikings came from and where they settled. The results showed a strong connection between certain regions of Scandinavia and specific parts of Europe. Vikings from what is now Denmark mostly traveled to England. Their genetic influence is clearly visible in modern British populations. Swedish Vikings primarily moved eastward into the Baltic region, including present-day Estonia, Latvia, Poland, and Ukraine. Norwegian Vikings focused their expansion westward, reaching Ireland, Iceland, and Greenland. These patterns were so consistent that they could not be explained by chance. They suggested a level of organization that historians had not fully recognized before. This discovery challenges the idea that Vikings were loosely organized raiders driven only by violence or greed. Instead, Viking society appears to have been structured around established travel networks, shared knowledge, and inherited traditions. Routes were likely passed down through families and communities, creating long-term connections between specific regions. DNA evidence also revealed that Vikings from different parts of Scandinavia rarely mixed with each other genetically, even though they shared a common cultural identity. Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian Vikings often kept their bloodlines separate. This separation is surprising because these groups lived relatively close to one another and identified as Vikings. Yet their genetic profiles show limited intermarriage. The reasons for this remain unclear. It may have been due to social boundaries, regional loyalties, or differences in political organization. Whatever the cause, the result was a Viking world divided into distinct regional groups with their own traditions and destinations. The study also showed that Viking expansion involved both men and women. In some regions, especially in the eastern Baltic, there was a notable genetic contribution from women, suggesting that Viking settlements were not temporary camps but long-term communities. Families formed, children were born, and Viking culture became rooted in new lands. This explains why Viking influence remained strong long after raids ended. They did not simply attack and leave. They stayed, integrated, and reshaped local populations. The DNA evidence helps us understand how Viking culture spread so widely and deeply. Organized movement allowed knowledge, skills, and traditions to travel along with people. Ships connected distant communities, creating a network that spanned thousands of miles. This hidden order behind Viking expansion explains why their impact was so lasting. rather than random destruction. The Viking Age was marked by structured exploration and settlement. The DNA study reveals that Vikings were not just fierce warriors, but skilled planners who understood geography, timing, and opportunity. Their success came not from chaos, but from connection. By uncovering these patterns, genetic research transforms our understanding of Viking expansion from a series of violent events into a complex process of migration, settlement, and cultural exchange. Point one most emotional and surprising findings from a Viking DNA study came from a burial site in Somme, Estonia. This discovery challenged a long-held belief that Viking raids were always carried out by carefully selected groups of elite warriors. At Somme, archaeologists uncovered 2 Viking ship burials containing the remains of 41 men. At first glance, the site appeared to confirm traditional ideas about Viking raids. The ships, weapons, and burial style clearly pointed to a Viking expedition. However, when scientists analyzed the DNA of the men buried there, they uncovered a much more personal and tragic story. Genetic testing revealed that many of the men were closely related. 4 of them were brothers, buried side by side. Others were cousins or close kin. These were not strangers brought together for a single mission. They were family members, neighbors, and people who likely grew up together in the same community. The DNA showed that most of these men came from a small region in Sweden, suggesting that the expedition was organized locally rather than drawn from across Scandinavia. This discovery changes how we understand Viking raids. Instead of elite armies, some expeditions were made up of ordinary people bound by family ties. These men may have set sail together out of shared ambition, loyalty, or hope for wealth and status. The tragedy becomes even clearer when examining the injuries found on the skeletons. Bone trauma revealed that these men suffered violent deaths, likely shortly after arriving in Estonia. Many had wounds consistent with close combat, indicating that they faced strong resistance. The expedition appears to have ended in disaster before it could achieve any success. The bodies were placed back into their ships and buried, preserving their story for over 1,000 years. This suggests that Viking raids were not always successful or well-planned. Some were risky ventures taken by groups who may have overestimated their abilities or underestimated their enemies. The Somme burials date to around 750 AD, placing them at the very beginning of the Viking Age. These men were among the first Vikings to venture beyond their homeland, and their failure highlights how dangerous early expeditions could be. This discovery humanizes Vikings in a powerful way. Instead of distant legends, we see real people taking real risks with their families. It shows that Viking society was built on personal relationships as much as on warfare. Family ties played a major role in who joined an expedition. This pattern was not unique to Somme. DNA evidence from other sites suggests that Viking groups often included relatives. This challenges the idea that Viking culture was strictly based on strength or combat skill. Loyalty, trust, and kinship mattered just as much. The Somme tragedy reminds us that the Viking Age was not a series of heroic victories. It was also filled with loss, failure, and sacrifice. These men's stories survived not through sagas or legends, but through their DNA. Their bones tell us that Vikings were not fearless warriors chosen by kings. They were families chasing opportunity in a dangerous world, sometimes paying the highest price. That realization that being a Viking was not strictly about ancestry. For centuries, historians assumed that Vikings were defined by their Scandinavian bloodlines. The DNA evidence shows something very different. Many individuals buried with full Viking honors had no genetic connection to Scandinavia at all. These people were dressed, armed, and buried exactly like Vikings, yet their DNA revealed origins in completely different populations. This discovery forces us to rethink what the word Viking actually meant during the Viking Age. In places like the Orkney Islands in Scotland, archaeologists uncovered graves that looked unmistakably Viking. The weapons, burial style, and symbols all pointed to Scandinavian origin. However, genetic analysis revealed that some of these individuals were closely related to local populations, such as the Picts, rather than the people from Scandinavia. These individuals had fully adopted Viking culture, even though their ancestors were not Viking. This was not an isolated case. Similar findings appeared at multiple sites across the Viking world. People from different backgrounds embraced Viking identity, customs, and way of life. At the same time, the reverse was also true. In England, Ireland, and other regions influenced by Viking settlement, scientists found people with clear Scandinavian ancestry who did not live as Vikings. Their burials followed local customs, and their lifestyles blended into surrounding societies. Their DNA said Scandinavian, but their culture said something else entirely. This shows that Viking identity was flexible and open. It was not a closed group defined by blood, but a social role that people could enter or leave. Becoming a Viking meant adopting a specific way of life centered on seafaring, raiding, trading, and exploration. It involved participating in a shared culture, not sharing a specific genetic background. This explains how Viking culture spread so rapidly and widely. People did not need to be born Viking to become one. They could join through alliance, marriage, loyalty, or opportunity. This openness made Viking society adaptable and resilient. It also challenges modern ideas about identity in the past. We often assume that ancient societies were rigid and exclusive. The DNA evidence suggests the opposite. Viking culture was surprisingly inclusive, allowing people from different regions to participate fully. This fluid identity also helps explain the diversity seen in Viking DNA. When people from different backgrounds joined Viking communities, they contributed their genes, traditions, and skills. Over time, this created a culture that was constantly changing and evolving. The idea of Viking as a lifestyle rather than a race reshapes how we understand medieval history. It shows that cultural identity in the past could be just as complex and flexible as it is today. The Viking Age was not defined by one group imposing itself on others. It was defined by interaction, adaptation, and shared practices. DNA has given us a new lens through which to view this period, revealing that Vikings were not born. They were made. Another remarkable insight from the largest Viking DNA study is how Vikings were not only shaping the world around them, but were themselves shaped by it. For a long time, history portrayed Vikings as unstoppable conquerors, traveling across Europe and leaving genetic and cultural marks wherever they went. DNA evidence reveals that this was only part of the story. Vikings both exported their genes and absorbed those of the people they encountered. When Vikings settled in new lands, whether in the British Isles, the Baltic region, or Greenland, they contributed to the local population's genetic makeup. But equally important, people from outside Scandinavia moved into Viking homelands. Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and even people from Western Asia arrived in Scandinavia during and just before the Viking Age. They brought not only new genes, but also new skills, ideas, and cultural practices. This bidirectional flow challenges a long-held idea that Vikings were isolated Scandinavian populations suddenly exploding outward. Instead, Vikings were part of a complex web of migration and exchange. Genetic analysis shows that Vikings adapted quickly to new environments and opportunities. For example, genes that helped adults digest milk or strengthen immune responses became more common, showing that populations were responding to environmental pressures and new diseases encountered during travel and settlement. In this way, Vikings were not genetically static. They evolved as they moved, mixing with diverse populations and adapting over generations. This interplay between influence and adaptation also explains why Viking culture was so dynamic. It was not a rigid set of rules passed unchanged from one generation to the next. Instead, it was a living culture